Well, this is an absolutely momentous occasion in Excel history. Now, to give you context on how momentous this is, Excel came out on September 30th, 1985. That was 40 years ago. Now, at the time, it didn't contain pivot table functionality. 8 years later, in Excel version 5, that's when pivot tables were introduced. Now, I started with Excel in version 4, which came out the year before in 1992, and pivot tables didn't exist. So a year later, for me, they came out, and they changed everything. But from that version 5 in 1993, on day one, everybody asked the exact same question. How can I get my pivot tables to automatically refresh when my data changes? Because that functionality was not built in. Now, there's a really good reason for this, and that's because the pivot table doesn't actually look at the data, it looks at a copy of the data, and that copy is known as the pivot cache. Now, the reason it looks at this copy is because that copy is optimized. It's deduplicated, it's compressed, there's all sorts of calculations that take place in the background, and it's what makes pivot tables one of the fastest calculating things in Excel. But because of that in-between layer of data, when you change the actual data, the pivot table can't see it because the pivot table is not looking at the data. The pivot table is looking at the cache. So we have to go into our pivot table and do something like a right-click refresh to dump the current cache and rebuild it from the changed data. So it's really been tedious that you don't get this auto-refresh update on pivot tables when your data changes. Now, there have been ways to overcome this with a little bit of VBA code and using special types of macros known as event-driven macros, so you could detect when a change happens in the spreadsheet and then automatically trigger that refresh. But here's what we no longer have to do. I have a data set here in blue named My Data, and this is a proper Excel table. So I'll make a quick small pivot table. I'll go up to Summarize with Pivot Table, and I'll choose to place this on an existing worksheet, and I'll just put it right here next to the data. Let me zoom out just a little bit, and it doesn't need to be anything fancy for this demo, so I'll put product in the rows and sales in the values. Now, in the old days, if we went in and changed any of these numbers, or if we went and added additional records to the data set, we'd have to come over to the pivot table, right-click, and choose Refresh. But if we go up to the Analyze ribbon, that Refresh button is here, just another way to do the refresh, but look what's to the left of it, Auto Refresh. Now, if the pivot table's contents change or records are added, we get an automatic update. So if I were to go into a sale and put in some wildly large number just so we can tell that something's changed, we see that the pivot table has automatically updated. If that was a typo, maybe that was supposed to be 6,500, I get an update on the pivot table. Likewise, if I were to add new records, so I'll go in here and highlight these new records, connect them to the existing table and extend its data set, and now the pivot table displays additional products with updated calculations. If I were to highlight rows in the table and then do something like right-click delete table rows, pivot table updates. So this auto refresh is a feature we've been asking for 32 years, 3+ decades. I was convinced I was going to go to my grave never having seen this option. But now we don't have to add some VBA hack code into the background, which, by the way, would also require us to save our files with a .xlsm extension, which then just ruins the deal for a lot of people. Now the feature's native. Now, before you just jump in and try to start using this, there are a few things you need to be aware of. First off, this feature is still in beta. So if you're not part of the beta program, you're not going to have this at all. And I have no idea when this will come out, but hopefully it'll be sooner than later. So you'll just have to keep checking your updates. The second thing is, if you don't wish to use this feature, you can go up and turn it off, and I can go in here and make all sorts of changes. My pivot table isn't going to change. But the catch is, if you said, hey, I want to use this feature now, I'll go ahead and turn on my auto refresh. Turning on auto refresh on data that's been changed before the feature was active does not automatically trigger a refresh. You still have to go up and hit the refresh button or go change something in the table. So if I change this to $2 to get everything to update. Now, because this is still in beta, hopefully that's a feature that will be addressed before this is released to the general public. Because I'm thinking if somebody does not use auto refresh, they go in and they turn it on, they'd want an instant update. But at this point, you'd have to force the refresh. Now, there is another way to turn this feature on and off, and that is on the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon. If you go to the upper left to the Pivot Table Options, on the Data tab, there's a new option here for automatically refresh when the source data changes. So that does the same thing as the button on the ribbon right here. Now, at the moment, the default behavior is to use this feature whenever you build a new pivot table. But what if you don't want this feature for whatever reason? You don't want to have to be mindful that every time you create a pivot table, you need to go up here and turn that feature off. So we can go into the program settings and make off be the default behavior. And to do that, we go up to File, then down to Options. Then in the Data section, Right here, make changes to the default layout of pivot tables. We'll edit the default layout, and then behind this pivot table options button, we can go to the data tab and then deactivate it here. By doing that, any new pivot tables you create, the auto refresh will be deactivated at the start. Now I'm going to turn mine back on, and I'm thinking you're going to want it on because I can't think of many reasons to not use this. Now here are a few other things to be mindful of when working with this auto refresh feature. Here I have this blue data set, and I have two pivot tables built from this same data set. So in between these two tables is a single pivot cache. Well, if I click on the left pivot table, go to Pivot Table Analyze, my auto refresh is on. If I go to the right pivot table, the auto refresh is on. In the right pivot table, if I turn auto refresh off, then when I go to the left pivot table, it's also off, because that auto refresh is dedicated to the underlying cache, not to the pivot tables themselves. So if you turn it off, you're turning it off for all pivot tables built from that cache. Over here on the right, I have a red data set and a pivot table built from that. And in between these two is another cache. Well, when I click on the red pivot table, auto refresh is on. When I click on the blue pivot table, auto refresh is off, because these are basically two separate worlds. So back in the blue tables, if I go to either of these pivot tables, turn on auto refresh, it's now on for both tables. If I go to the red table, turn auto refresh off, it does not turn auto refresh off for the blue tables, because again, separate caches. Now with auto refresh on, if you make a change, say in this blue table, that change is going to be reflected in all pivot tables derived from the pivot cache. So I see that $1 million entry in both blue pivot tables, but I don't see it in the red one. Again, different data set. If that was a typo, it was supposed to be $2,000. Both of those blue pivot tables have updated. If I go to the red pivot table, add in something like $1 million, the red pivot table did not update because the auto refresh is off. If I turn it on, I still don't see the $1 million entry, because remember, activating auto refresh does not trigger a refresh. Not until you click the refresh button or change something else in that red table. So I'll just hit refresh. Now that auto refresh is on, I'll take the $1 million out, replace it with 5,000, automatic update. One other thing to understand about the auto refresh, when you're first building the pivot table, if you choose the option to add this data to the data model so you can do maybe some sophisticated DAX calculations, this feature does not work. Now that's a limitation of this beta version of the feature, and I don't know if that limitation will be overcome by the time of release, but hopefully it will. But if not, you're going to have to use one of the older strategies of, say, VBA code detection refresh. So that's the up-and-coming pivot table auto refresh feature. 32 years in the making, and it's just about here. With any luck, it won't be long before we all have the feature. Let me know what you think about this new feature. Have you struggled with this for decades? Have you been waiting for it? Did you think you were going to go to your grave without seeing it? Let me know in the comments. And if you have this beta feature and you want to test it but you don't have any data, feel free to download this file. Thank you for watching, and remember, at BCTI, the learning never stops.